Very few people stop to reflect on the end of Joseph's life, the son of Jacob. Even fewer know the astonishing detail. His embalmed body remained for centuries locked in an Egyptian sarcophagus, never having been buried in the land he so longed for. Why? What motivated a man who became the most influential figure in the Egyptian empire to leave such a specific request regarding his bones? The truth is that, despite being honored as a prince in a foreign nation, Joseph never forgot his essence, his roots, or the promise that God had established with the patriarchs. His identity was not defined by human titles, but by the divine covenant. In this video, we will explore the profound meaning of his death, the symbolism behind his mummification, and how all this points to an even greater spiritual truth, the unwavering faithfulness of God. From the beginning, Joseph emerges as one of the most moving and inspiring characters. He was Jacob's favorite son and the firstborn of Rachel, the woman Jacob loved most. From his youth, Joseph sparked jealousy among his brothers, not only because of his father's special affection, but also because of the dreams he shared. Those visions suggested that one day he would be above all, something his brothers could not tolerate. Jacob, unaware of the effect he was causing, gifted Joseph a multicolored robe, a symbol of honor and distinction. That gesture only fueled his brothers' resentment further. In their fury, they planned to kill him, but ultimately decided to sell him as a slave to some Ishmaelite merchants bound for Egypt. Thus began Joseph's journey in a foreign land, a voyage marked by injustices, yet also by divine purpose. Once in Egypt, Joseph was purchased by Potiphar, a high-ranking official of the Pharaoh. In his household, Joseph soon demonstrated integrity and skill, earning his master's trust. However, he fell victim to injustice. Potiphar's wife attempted to seduce him and, when rejected, falsely accused him. As a result, Joseph was thrown into prison, not for having done wrong, but for remaining true to his principles. Even in jail, Joseph did not lose his faith. His character and wisdom set him apart from the others. There he interpreted the dreams of the Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker, and what he said came to pass with precision. Later, when the Pharaoh had dreams that no one could explain, the cupbearer remembered Joseph. Summoned before the king, Joseph interpreted the dreams, revealing a future of 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of extreme famine. Impressed by his insight, the Pharaoh appointed Joseph as the governor of Egypt, making him the second most powerful man in the kingdom. He was entrusted with managing the food during the years of abundance to prepare the country for the coming scarcity. When the time of famine arrived, not only Egypt, but also neighboring nations turned to Joseph for sustenance. Among them were his own brothers, who did not recognize that the man before them was the very one they had sold. That encounter was filled with emotion. Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not identify him. He tested them, observing whether their hearts had changed. Seeing their genuine remorse and concern for their family, Joseph could no longer hold back his tears. He revealed his identity tenderly, embracing them and assuring them that everything that had happened was allowed by God to save many lives. It was a moment of redemption and family restoration. After the reconciliation, Joseph invited his entire family to live in Egypt. Jacob, his sons, and all his descendants settled in the region of Goshen, a fertile land ideal for grazing. There, Joseph continued to protect them with generosity and care. When Jacob sensed that his death was near, he requested to be buried in Canaan, alongside his ancestors. Joseph promised to fulfill that wish, and did so with great honor after his father's death. Over time, Joseph's brothers began to fear that after Jacob's death, he would seek vengeance for the past. However, Joseph reaffirmed his forgiveness with words full of faith and comfort. He told them that even though they had intended harm, God had turned it into good. This statement recorded in Genesis 50:20, remains one of the most powerful affirmations of divine sovereignty and the redemptive purpose that God can bring out of suffering. In his old age, Joseph remained in Egypt, surrounded by his numerous descendants. The Bible highlights that he lived to see children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and even great-great-grandchildren, a sign of the blessing and prosperity that accompanied him. His longevity was remarkable, 110 years, a symbolic age in Egyptian culture representing a full life marked by honor, wisdom, and success. In that culture, reaching 110 years was considered the ideal of existence. In his final days, Joseph reaffirmed God's promise made to the patriarchs. He prophesied that the day would come when God would visit Israel and bring them out of Egypt to the promised land. With that clear vision, he requested that when it happened, his bones be carried with them. His faith remained steadfast, even in the face of death. He did not cling to Egyptian splendor, but to the hope of the fulfillment of God's promise, reaffirming his identity as a child of the covenant. The book of Genesis concludes with this solemn act. Joseph died at 110 years of age, was embalmed according to Egyptian practices, and placed in a coffin, where he would remain until his remains were taken to the promised land. This detail is significant. It symbolizes that even in death, Joseph never stopped looking toward eternal promises. His faith was a beacon for future generations, showing that God's covenant transcends life and death. The fact that Joseph was mummified and placed in a sarcophagus reflects the high esteem in which the Egyptian people held him. This kind of treatment was reserved for individuals of great stature, such as nobles, priests, and members of royalty. Mummification in Egypt was a refined practice, laden with spiritual symbolism. Joseph's embalming demonstrates that although he was a foreigner, he was integrated into the heart of that powerful culture without losing his true identity. Another important detail is the age at which he died. The number 110 had a special meaning in Egyptian tradition. It represented a perfect life, filled with wisdom, justice, and achievement. It was not always taken literally, but as an ideal of a full existence. By recording that Joseph lived to that age, the biblical account seems to establish a bridge between Hebrew and Egyptian cultures, showing how his life was significant for both worlds. The Bible does not mention any illness or suffering that caused his death, suggesting that Joseph passed away in peace, surrounded by his family after a life marked by faith, forgiveness, and purpose. After his departure, the Israelites continued to live in Egypt, particularly in the region of Goshen, enjoying stability and favorable conditions. But that time of favor was only temporary, for great changes that would deeply affect the people of Israel were soon to come. Some scholars assert that Joseph lived during the period when the Hyksos, a Semitic people, ruled parts of Egypt. This might explain why a Hebrew was elevated to such a high position. However, the Bible does not mention the name of any pharaoh, leaving room for different interpretations. What is certain is that over time everything changed. A new pharaoh arose, one who did not know Joseph or the legacy he had left in Egyptian history. That new pharaoh marked the beginning of a dark era. Fearing the growing numbers of the Israelites, he saw them as a potential threat. He thought that, in the event of war, they might ally with Egypt's enemies. For that reason, he decided to subject them to forced labor. Thus began a long period of slavery, where the people who had once prospered under Joseph's favor were cruelly oppressed. The harmony that had existed turned into collective suffering. This new scenario of pain would serve as the backdrop for one of the greatest biblical events, the Exodus. Amid oppression, God would raise a deliverer, Moses, to guide the people to freedom. Yet remarkably, long before that, Joseph had already shown concern for the future of Israel. Although he had achieved glory in Egypt, he never allowed his heart to be separated from the promises given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Therefore, before he died, he left a clear request that his bones be carried to the promised land when God fulfilled his word. Although it might seem like a simple detail, it carried profound meaning. Joseph did not want his remains to rest in a foreign land, no matter how luxurious or powerful it might be. He desired to be buried in the place of the covenant, in the territory that represented the spiritual heritage of his people. That revealed where his true hope lay. Centuries later, as narrated in the book of Exodus, that promise was fulfilled. When Moses led the people out of Egypt, Joseph's bones were taken with them. That act was not merely symbolic. It represented the living faith of a patriarch who, even in death, pointed to the fulfillment of God's word. His legacy transcended time, and his name was remembered as a testament to faithfulness to the eternal. So much so that the author of Hebrews, in chapter 11, known as the Hall of Faith, mentions Joseph for this very act. He recounts that before he died, Joseph spoke about the exodus of the children of Israel and gave instructions regarding his bones. That gesture was seen as an act of deep faith. Joseph, who had lived surrounded by splendor in Egypt, never stopped believing that his ultimate destiny was tied to the divine promises, not to fleeting glory. Joseph's life and death teach us that God continues to write his story even amid unexpected circumstances. From the pit to the palace, from betrayal to restoration, Joseph lived guided by absolute trust in divine purpose. His attitude in the face of pain was one of hope. His response to rejection was forgiveness. His gaze was always set beyond the visible, believing that everything had a greater purpose. Therefore, although the book of Genesis ends with Joseph's death, his story is not an ending. It is the prologue to something much greater. His life pointed to the God who transforms suffering into purpose and death into living hope. Joseph became a living symbol of God's faithfulness, not only for his generation, but for all that would follow. And in his farewell, he continued to point to the future. The promised redemption was yet to come. In Genesis 15, God had already revealed to Abraham that his descendants would live as foreigners in a strange land where they would be oppressed for a long time. But he also promised that, at the right moment, they would leave there free and enriched. It is in that context that we must understand Joseph's death. His request regarding his bones was not a mere personal wish. It was a prophetic declaration about the destiny of his people. That seemingly small detail anticipated Moses' mission, the Exodus, and the birth of Israel as a free nation. Joseph's death does not mark the end of a biography, but the continuation of the divine covenant through the generations. Theologically, his farewell was a sign that God had not finished his work. From the fields of Canaan to the palaces of Egypt, divine faithfulness remained intact. Joseph lived wisely, governed justly, and forgave wholeheartedly. Despite all the honors he received, he never lost sight of who he was, a son of the promise. The faith that sustained him in slavery, in prison, and in exile was the same that accompanied him in his final days. And before he closed his eyes forever, he made it clear, God will surely visit you and take you out of this place. Many years later, as recorded in Joshua 24:32, his bones were buried in Shechem, in the Promised Land. Thus, the desire of his heart was fulfilled. His story reminds us that God's faithfulness spans generations, and that although our circumstances may change, his promise endures. Joseph was a witness to that. And will you also trust in the one who transforms pain into blessing and death into living hope? Above all, may this study lead you to a greater gratitude for the extraordinary privilege we have of being adopted by God as his beloved children. May it renew your daily hope, strengthen your faith, and inspire you to live fully in the celestial identity received through Christ. Share these truths with others so that they too may discover and experience the richness of this spiritual revelation. Thank you for joining us on this spiritual and theological journey. We sincerely hope that this content has enriched your life and edified your faith. If this study has blessed you, do not forget to share it with others. Together, we will carry even further the profound truths of God's Word. See you in the next video, and may God bless you abundantly.